Ethan never expected a blind date to change his life. He had spent the better part of 3 years convincing himself that he was fine, that the quiet apartment, the drafting table covered in blueprints, and the half-eaten dinners in front of the television were enough. He was a man who had learned to exist in the margins of his own story. And on most days, that felt acceptable. He had his work, residential architecture, the slow and intimate craft of designing spaces for people who trusted him with the most private geometry of their daily lives. He had a small group of friends he trusted, and a city that offered, on good days, the comfortable illusion of companionship through sheer density of human proximity. He had a routine that carried him through the weeks without asking too much of him. And in the absence of something larger, routine had the quiet mercy of keeping things manageable. But his friends had other ideas. And the most persistent among them was Marcus, his college roommate. A man with the particular conviction of someone who had found domestic happiness and who believed, with missionary sincerity, that everyone in his orbit deserved the same. Marcus had been pushing him toward the dating apps for the better part of a year. And when Ethan deleted the third one in 3 months, Marcus simply took matters into his own hands. He arranged a dinner, called it casual, and told Ethan only that it was someone worth meeting. So on a Thursday evening in early October, Ethan adjusted his collar in the mirror of a downtown restaurant bathroom, told himself this would be perfectly ordinary, and walked out to meet a woman who would unravel everything he thought he understood about trust, sacrifice, and love. Victoria Hayes was already seated when he arrived. She sat at the corner table in a sleek black wheelchair, her posture impeccably straight, her dark hair pinned back at the nape of her neck with a quiet precision that suggested a woman who controlled every variable available to her. She wore a deep navy blazer and no jewelry except for a single thin gold ring on her right hand, and she held the menu at an angle that managed to look both relaxed and alert, as though she was the kind of person who was always half ready for whatever the room might require next. She looked, Ethan thought, like someone who was completely accustomed to being watched, and who had made her peace with that fact years ago. The restaurant fell slightly quiet when he approached, the way rooms sometimes do when something important is about to happen, though no one present could have explained exactly why. He pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and said, "I'm Ethan. I apologize in advance. Marcus has terrible taste in restaurants." Victoria blinked. Then, slowly, a smile crossed her face. Not the polished, press-ready expression she wore in photographs and public appearances, something smaller and more real. Something that she would realize, much later, she had not entirely intended to give away. Most people, when they met Victoria for the first time, could not get past the wheelchair. They spoke to her in softer voices, as though her mobility had some bearing on her hearing. They over-explained menus and held doors with excessive ceremony and tilted their heads at angles meant to convey compassion, but that communicated instead a kind of gentle reduction, the well-meaning assumption that suffering and limitation were the most interesting things about her, that the story of the obstacle was the whole story. The business media had been covering her for 4 years as the young CEO who had taken over her late father's technology conglomerate from a wheelchair, and the narrative had calcified into something sentimental and ultimately reductive. She was used to being a symbol before she was a person. She was used to people looking at her and seeing a story they already knew the shape of before she had said a word. Ethan didn't do any of that. He handed her a bread roll without ceremony and asked whether she preferred horror films or comedies. And when she said neither, he laughed and said he respected the honesty. She watched him across the table with an expression she didn't fully recognize in herself, something cautious and curious and unexpectedly warm, the tentative movement of a door that had been kept very firmly closed for a very long time. By the end of the evening, she had told him more about herself than she had told anyone in years. Not the important things, not yet. Those would come later with their enormous weight, but the texture of things. That she hated the smell of fresh paint with an intensity that had no rational explanation. That she had tried to learn the cello at 30 and given up after 6 weeks because her teacher kept using the word perseverance in a tone that made her want to put the instrument through a wall. That her favorite time of day was the hour just before sunrise, when the city was still mostly dark and the air had a particular quality of held silence. She couldn't describe precisely, but could always feel in her chest a breath before the world's noise began again, a brief window of something that felt like possibility untouched by obligation. Ethan listened, without performing interest. He didn't nod excessively or mirror her expressions or produce any of the well-rehearsed signals of active listening that paradoxically make a person feel less heard. He simply listened and asked questions that came from genuine curiosity rather than social obligation, and waited for the answers with a patience that felt, to Victoria, like an unusual and slightly alarming luxury. When the check came, he reached for it without ceremony, and they sat for another 40 minutes after the restaurant had begun clearing its other tables. Outside, at the curb, before her driver pulled around, Ethan said, "I don't want to know about the company, or the wheelchair, or any of the things I've already read about you. I just want to know you." Victoria looked at him for a long moment in the October lamplight. A loose strand of hair moved across her face in the wind, and she didn't push it back. "That might take a while," she said. He smiled. "I've got time." It was the first time in longer than she could honestly remember that she had believed someone who said that. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that surprised them both. They met for dinner on Tuesdays, sometimes Thursdays, and once on a Saturday afternoon that started as a quick coffee and became 7 hours without either of them registering the passage of time, in the way time usually passes when you are watching it. They walked through the botanical gardens on that long Saturday, Ethan walking, Victoria in her chair, and argued cheerfully about whether succulents qualified as real plants in the fullest moral sense of the term, a debate with no resolution that both of them enjoyed, with an unreasonable amount of enthusiasm. He pushed her wheelchair when the path grew narrow and the gradient steep, not because she couldn't manage, but because she let him, which was its own kind of intimacy, the small daily act of allowing someone into the physical space of your life. She was not accustomed to letting people in, and Ethan seemed to understand this intuitively, the way a person understands that a door left slightly ajar is an invitation, and that pushing too hard will only make it close again. He moved slowly. He asked questions and waited. He never pressed. Victoria found herself looking forward to Tuesdays with an urgency that mildly alarmed her. That she noted the way you note a shift in the weather, not with concern. Exactly. But with careful attention. There were concerts, a jazz ensemble in a small venue with the right combination of dim lighting and excellent acoustics, the kind of room where the music felt physical, like something pressing gently against the chest from the inside. There was a rooftop dinner in November where they shared a blanket against the cold, and watched the city lights flicker in the wind, and talked about the kinds of things people only speak aloud when they feel genuinely safe, when the usual social economy of impression management has been set aside in favor of something less careful and more true. She told him about her father that night. Not the public version, not the visionary founder whose portrait hung in the corporate lobby, and whose legacy was invoked at every shareholder meeting with the reverence people afford the dead, but the private man, the one who had read to her every night until she was 12, and told her without qualification that she was the most capable person he had ever known, in the absolute and unconditional way that only certain parents, and very few others, can mean something. The man whose sudden death had left her holding the entire weight of a company and a legacy at 28 years old. Surrounded by a board of directors, who looked at her and calculated liability, Ethan said nothing for a moment after she finished speaking. Then he said simply, "That sounds impossibly heavy." And the simplicity of that, the absence of silver linings and motivational framings, and the particular exhausting encouragement people produce when they don't know what else to do, undid something in her chest that she hadn't known was wound tight until she felt it finally release. Ethan offered his own history in return. With the same absence of performance or self-pity, the marriage that had ended not in catastrophe but in the quieter tragedy of two people who had wanted different lives and spent too many years being too polite to admit it. His ex-wife was not a villain in his telling she had been a good person, and they had been genuinely mismatched, and they had both waited too long to acknowledge what that meant and act on it honestly. The divorce, when it finally came, had been civilized and genuinely painful, which in some ways was harder than a clean break because it offered no clear narrative, no moment of crisis to point to, no story that made obvious sense to anyone, including himself. He had thrown himself into his work after the private residences, the intimate trust of designing spaces around the actual contours of people's lives, and had told himself that was sufficient. On most days it was. But some evenings, when the apartment was quiet and the drafting table held nothing urgent, he could feel the emptiness as a physical pressure in the sternum, faint but persistent, the body registering what the mind preferred not to name directly. Victoria didn't offer easy comfort about any of this. She simply listened and then said, "You design homes for other people. Have you ever figured out what you want yours to feel like?" He thought about that question for weeks afterward, turning it over in the quiet hours, not arriving at an answer, but understanding that the question itself was important. She kissed him first. It was a Wednesday evening in December. Outside the entrance of a chamber music hall, after a performance of something slow and aching that had left them both quietly undone in the way live music sometimes manages the particular vulnerability of being moved by something in public, in the company of someone who notices. He had been making an observation about the cellist and the quality of attention she brought to the instrument when Victoria reached up and took his coat lapel in one hand and kissed him with the directness that was entirely characteristic of her, certain and unhurried, and entirely without ambiguity. He stood still for a moment, surprised in the best possible way, and then he kissed her back, and the cold December air around them felt charged with something that had been building for weeks, without either of them giving it a name, because sometimes you don't name things before they're ready, before the naming would be accurate, rather than merely hopeful. A woman walking past them smiled. Neither of them noticed. It was, for both of them, the feeling of arriving somewhere they had been traveling toward without a map, and the arrival was quiet and certain and exactly right, and nothing like anything either of them had planned. And yet, even in those early weeks of warmth and something that was quietly becoming the most significant relationship either of them had known in years, Ethan began noticing things that didn't quite fit together. Small things at first, the kind that get filed away without analysis, because the overall picture is too good to want to disturb. Victoria had rules, specific, consistent, non-negotiable rules governing how and when he could appear in her life. He was not to come to her apartment without calling first. He was not to visit her office after 6 in the evening, and preferably not at all without a scheduled appointment. Her security team was always present on their outings, 2 men in dark clothing who stationed themselves at a discreet distance that never fully dissolved, never fully relaxed into something that looked like ordinary street presence. He had assumed standard precaution for a billionaire CEO and left it at that. The world was full of unusual people, and wealth and visibility attracted their particular attentions. But over time, the shape of these rules began to feel less like practical caution and more like deliberate architecture, something specifically constructed to control exactly what he could see and when and under what conditions. He tried once, on impulse, to bring her coffee from the place she had mentioned loving, showing up at her building on a weekday morning with 2 cups in a carrier, and the genuine and uncomplicated intent of seeing her for 15 minutes before her day began. Her assistant met him at the lobby door with a polished apology and a suggestion that he call ahead next time. Victoria called him 30 minutes later, entirely pleasant, thanking him for thinking of her. But something in the cadence of the conversation was fractionally wrong, a half-beat too rehearsed, a quality of prepared response rather than natural reaction, the slight smoothness of someone who has anticipated a moment and is now handling it rather than living it. He told himself he was imagining it. He almost convinced himself. There were also inconsistencies in the public record, which he found without really looking for them, a late-night search that began as idle curiosity and took on a different quality as the contradictions accumulated beyond what could be explained by normal variation reporting. The official account was consistent. A spinal injury sustained in a car accident 4 years prior had left Victoria Hayes requiring a wheelchair for most activities. But archived interviews from different publications told slightly different stories that couldn't be fully reconciled. One profile described her injury as permanent and unlikely to improve significantly. Another quoted a medical consultant suggesting the damage might be partially reversible with sustained treatment and time. A third mentioned only that she had declined to discuss the specifics of her condition with reporters, which was entirely her right, but which, combined with the other inconsistencies, created a texture of evasion rather than privacy. The difference being one of intent. He read these things at his drafting table at midnight, his coffee going cold beside him, and tried to arrange the pieces into a shape that resolved cleanly. They didn't. He put his phone down and went to bed and told himself it didn't matter. He woke at 3 in the morning, still thinking about it, his mind working on something his conscious attention had not yet caught up to. The cracks appeared gradually, the way they always do in things built on hidden load-bearing structures. In January, their Tuesday dinners became inconsistent. 2 cancellations in 1 week, both with warm and specific apologies that still carried the hollow quality of being managed rather than genuinely spoken to the difference between someone who is truly sorry and someone who is very skilled at producing the correct emotional register for a given situation. She would disappear for days at a stretch, not completely. She always texted, always responded within a reasonable window. But there was a quality of managed distance to her presence that he felt even when her name appeared on his screen, as though the texts were dispatches from a place she wasn't entirely in, rather than points of genuine contact. She told him there was a board restructuring in progress, a complicated series of decisions requiring her full attention. He believed her. He also believed that she was not telling him everything, which was different from lying but was not entirely separate from it either, and which produced its own variety of loneliness. One evening he called at 9, and the phone rang to voicemail. He tried at 10. Nothing. He sat on his couch, watching the clock, and felt something he recognized from the last unhappy months of his marriage, the specific anxiety of caring deeply about someone who has placed a wall between themselves and you, that you can't see clearly enough to navigate around, because the wall is invisible and may not be fully deliberate, but is there regardless, and you keep running into it in the dark. When she called the following morning, she was apologetic and specific. A crisis with a major supplier, a board member who had deviated from an agreed position, 3 hours in an emergency session that had run into the night. It was all plausible. It was all reasonable. Something in him had shifted anyway, a small but irreversible degree. The way a door doesn't hang true after being slammed even once. She received a call one afternoon during one of their better recent Saturdays, a lunch that had been going well, the easy kind of afternoon that reminded him of the early weeks before things had grown complicated. Her face changed when she looked at the screen. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone unfamiliar with her would have caught, but he was watching closely by then, with the attention that develops in people who have begun to sense that something important is being withheld, and he saw it. She excused herself and left the dining room. And when she returned 12 minutes later, the pleasant quality of the afternoon had been replaced by something brittle and careful, as though a portion of her attention was now elsewhere, and the rest of her was managing the performance of its own absence. She said she was sorry. He said it was fine. They finished lunch with pleasant conversation about things that didn't matter. She held his hand in the car afterward. He held hers back. They both pretended that the easy afternoon hadn't been interrupted by something he still wasn't allowed to know about, and neither of them addressed the pretending directly, because sometimes the pretending is all that holds things steady while you wait to understand what's actually happening. The night everything changed was a Wednesday in late February. Ethan woke at 2 in the morning with the particular alert wakefulness that follows a dream. He couldn't hold the sensation of being pulled suddenly from somewhere without knowing where you were or why the alarm inside you was sounding. He lay in the dark for a while, listening to the city outside, and then got up, pulled on a sweater, and stood at his apartment window with a glass of water, looking down at the street below. His building stood on a corner, and from his window he had a clear view of the intersection and a stretch of the block leading toward the parking structure. The street at that hour was nearly empty. A taxi moved through the intersection. A couple walked quickly with their collars up against the February cold, and then, at the far edge of the lamplight, a familiar black SUV pulled smoothly to the curb, the one with the small scratch on the rear quarter panel that he had noticed idly weeks ago, and registered the way you register small details about things that are regularly present in your life. He watched as the passenger door opened. He watched as Victoria's bodyguard stepped around to the rear door and opened it, and he watched as Victoria Hayes, the woman he was falling in love with, the woman the entire corporate world knew as a wheelchair-bound CEO, stepped out of the vehicle and stood upright on the sidewalk, not with effort, not with assistance, not with any of the small, visible compensations that characterize movement in a body that is managing a genuine limitation. She stood up from the car with the easy fluid movement of a person who has no limitation to compensate for and never has, and she walked across the pavement toward the glass doors of the building opposite with a stride that was even and purposeful and completely, impossibly, undeniably normal. The door closed behind her. The bodyguard returned to the vehicle. The street was quiet again. Ethan did not move for a very long time. He stood at the window with his glass of water growing warm in his hand and felt the world rearrange itself around him in a way that had no comfortable name and no immediate resolution. He replayed what he had seen. He considered the angle of the light and the possibility of distance distorting perception, and he dismissed both, because the light had been clear and the distance had been less than 30 yards, and he was a man who made his living reading space and proportion and mass with precision, and he knew exactly what he had seen, and he knew he had not mistaken it. He went back to bed. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, until the room grew gradually light with morning. He did not sleep. He told no one. He went to work the next day, answered emails, sat through a client meeting about a residential renovation in the hills, and carried the knowledge through all of it, with the particular stillness of someone processing something enormous in the quietest possible room of themselves. He did not call Victoria that day. He drove back to his building that evening and sat in his car and looked at the glass door she had entered the night before. It was a commercial building, unremarkable, a placard by the entrance he couldn't read from his angle. He sat there for 20 minutes and then drove home. Over the following 2 weeks, he watched with the focused patience of an architect the specific discipline of observing a structure fully before forming any conclusion about it. 3 more occasions, the same vehicle, the same address, the same unhesitant stride. Each time she emerged from the SUV and walked with complete normality. Each time she entered the same building and emerged between 1 and 2 hours later, upright, and was driven away. The wheelchair was, for whatever reason, a public instrument. It was worn in daylight, in restaurants, at events, in every context where the world was watching. It came off after dark, in private, in the company of people she trusted absolutely with everything she was. He searched the address. It was listed as a private legal suite, a small firm specializing in corporate litigation. He sat with that for a long while. He thought about the lawyer she had mentioned once, obliquely, as someone who had known her family for many years. He thought about the private investigator she had referenced even more obliquely in a conversation about corporate security that he had not considered significant at the time. He thought about all the things Victoria had never said, and began to understand that the careful architecture of her silences was as deliberate as the careful architecture of everything else about her. He went deeper into the history of Hayes Technologies, with the focused attention he usually reserved for complex site analyses, reading the full structure of a problem before committing to any response. What he found was a story that the business press had covered in pieces, but never quite assembled into a coherent whole. The death of Robert Hayes, founder and patriarch, attributed to heart failure in a man who by all accounts had been in excellent health at his last annual physical examination, a succession that had placed his daughter at the helm of a multi-billion-dollar technology empire at 28, at an age the board had never accepted without qualification, in a room full of men who had spent 30 years building their own certainty about what leadership looked like. A quiet but significant reorganization of ownership in the year following Robert's death, not announced as a reorganization, framed instead as a governance modernization that shifted substantial voting power to a group of 3 senior executives who could, acting in concert, theoretically remove the CEO from her position if they chose to. Ethan found the proxy filings for that restructuring in the public record and read them twice. The language was bland and technical and contained, in its precise, deliberate neutrality, the clear shape of a plan. Victoria had held on year after year despite this structure, despite a board culture that had never been warm to her, despite the industry's skepticism about her age and relative inexperience at the time of her father's death. The press had attributed her survival to personal determination and, more condescendingly, to the public sympathy generated by her visible disability, the narrative that even those who doubted her abilities could not vote against the woman in the wheelchair without appearing monstrous. Ethan, reading that now with 4 years of financial reporting arranged in front of him, understood it differently. He remembered the remark she had made early on. In the first weeks of their relationship, Before any of this had registered that people always underestimate the person they pity. He had taken it as a general observation about the world, perhaps a note of personal experience folded into something that sounded philosophical. It was neither general nor accidental. It was the precise distillation of a strategy that had been operating for years, expressed in a single sentence to a man she was only beginning to trust. In a restaurant over a bread roll, on a Thursday evening in October, he came to her on a Sunday afternoon in March. Having called ahead as the rule required, which he still observed not out of compliance, but out of respect for the process of things, she was at her apartment, dressed casually, and she met him in the living room with a quality of alertness that told him she had been expecting something like this. Even if she didn't know its precise shape, he sat across from her and said, quietly, without accusation, "I saw you walking 2 weeks ago, from my window, and 3 more times after that." He waited. She did not deny it. Id Chapter Liebervox and depressed. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her face held something he had not seen before, not the composed control of the CEO, not the careful warmth she reserved for him, but something raw and exhausted and almost, he thought, relieved, the expression of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has been given, at last, a reason to put it down. The city moved outside the windows the way it always moved, indifferent and continuous. Between the two of them, the room was very still, and she told him everything, not the public version, not the strategy and outline, but the full interior account, the way a thing looks from inside the years you spent living it, rather than from the outside where it becomes a narrative with a shape. 4 years ago, in the months following her father's death, Caroline, her legal counsel since childhood, a woman who understood corporate power with the cold clarity of 30 years spent inside it, had come to her with a warning. The ownership restructuring was not merely a political maneuver born of ordinary ambition. There was evidence, Caroline believed, of financial fraud, stretching back into the final year of Robert Hayes's tenure. A careful and systematic scheme, implicating 3 senior executives. The evidence could only be gathered slowly, covertly, without alerting its subjects, because the people who had designed the scheme were careful and well-connected and had built substantial protection around themselves. They could not be confronted directly. They had to be convinced they were safe. They had to keep making mistakes, and someone had to be watching everyone. The wheelchair had been Caroline's idea, and Victoria had agreed to it, with the resolve of someone who has examined every available path and found only one that could work. The logic was precise and entirely unsentimental. Powerful men in corporate environments consistently underestimate women, and they underestimate visibly disabled women most comprehensively of all. A CEO who appeared physically limited would not register as a serious threat in the minds of people who were already inclined to dismiss her. Her enemies would relax their guard. They would speak too freely in rooms they assumed were safe. They would make moves they would otherwise have been too cautious to attempt. They would assume she was distracted by the demands of her condition, when in fact she had none. They would be wrong, and she would be watching everything. She had spent 4 years in the wheelchair. At every board meeting, every industry conference, every press event, and investor call, and media appearance. At home, in private, in the company of her security team and Caroline, she moved without any restriction whatsoever. The injury had been real, a minor accident with a swift and complete recovery, entirely healed within 8 months. The late-night visits to the legal suite were meetings with Caroline in a location selected specifically because it could not be easily monitored from her corporate offices or by anyone watching her public movements. The private investigator had spent years building a financial record spanning hundreds of documents and thousands of transactions, a timeline of fraud so detailed and thoroughly corroborated that it could not be credibly disputed. The case was, at the moment, Ethan sat across from her on a Sunday afternoon in March, approximately 3 months from being ready to take into the open. She told him all of this in a voice that was quiet and precise, and entirely without self-pity. When she finished, she looked at him and said, "I am sorry I didn't tell you, not because I doubted you specifically, but because the fewer people who knew, the safer the case was, and the safer you were from being connected to it in any way that could be used against you or against me. He was silent for a long time. He examined himself carefully for anger, the way you might check a room in the dark, feeling for walls. What he found instead was something much closer to awe at the scale of what she had been carrying, at the precision and the courage of the strategy, and at the profound and specific loneliness of being the only person in a room who knows the full truth of something important and cannot share it with anyone. He said, "You've been doing this alone for 4 years." She said, "Mostly." He said, "That sounds impossibly heavy." She looked at him, and he saw her recognize the words he had said them once before, on the rooftop in November, about her father, and the recognition moved across her face like light across water. "It was," she said quietly. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. She let him hold it, and they sat like that for a while in the Sunday afternoon light. The city continuing its ordinary business outside, while nothing between them needed any further explanation. The months that followed moved with the particular intensity of things that have been long in preparation and are finally ready to become real. Caroline's case was completed in late April, a precise and devastating assembly of financial records, internal communications, and witness testimony documenting a systematic fraud that dated back to the final year of Robert Hayes's life. The 3 executives at the center of it had no idea what was approaching. They had spent 4 years operating under the comfortable assumption that their target was limited and distracted and increasingly isolated, that the woman at the head of the table was managing the difficulties of her condition rather than managing them. They had been operating under exactly the conditions she had spent 4 years deliberately creating. The disclosure was made simultaneously through regulatory channels, and 2 major investigative journalists given embargoed access, timed with the precision of something that had been planned for years. When it broke entirely. Filings went simultaneously to the financial authorities, the board of directors, and the 2 journalists, who published within hours of each other on a Tuesday morning. The story was enormous. The company's stock moved violently in both directions over the following 48 hours. The board called an emergency session. The 3 executives, confronted with documentation they could not credibly dispute, retained criminal defense attorneys and said nothing publicly. Victoria walked into the emergency board session on her own feet, in a dark suit, without assistance or accommodation of any kind, and placed 4 years of meticulously assembled documentation on the table in front of men who had spent 4 years believing she was something she was not. The room went quiet in the fundamental way of people who are absorbing something they had not prepared for and do not have an immediate framework to contain. She called the meeting to order without ceremony and spent 4 hours presenting her evidence in a voice that did not waver and did not rush and did not ask for any reaction it hadn't already earned. The press coverage was extraordinary, a story that transformed, within 72 hours, from a corporate fraud investigation into something the media decided was a narrative about deception and survival and a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself in advance and doesn't require anyone's permission. Every major publication ran the story. Financial reporters who had covered Hayes Technologies for years wrote pieces with a quality of genuine surprise, which was unusual for a profession professionally committed to appearing unsurprised. Technology journalists focused on the governance implications, the ways a company could be quietly hollowed out from the inside by the people nominally responsible for protecting it. General news outlets focused on Victoria herself, on the 4 years she had spent in a wheelchair she didn't need, on the discipline required to maintain that performance through every public appearance and every board meeting and every press photograph, while simultaneously building the case that would eventually bring the whole structure down. The photographs that circulated most widely were 2 images placed side by side. Victoria, at a press conference 2 years prior, seated in her wheelchair with her hands folded in her lap, composed and still, in the way she had been publicly composed and still for years. And Victoria, walking out of the federal building where the formal charges were filed, upright and unassisted in the same dark suit, her stride even and unhurried and entirely without drama. The contrast was stark and complete, and not something anyone who saw it forgot easily. The 3 senior executives at the center of the scheme were charged with securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and obstruction. 2 others in their orbit resigned from the company within the same week, their departures announced in brief corporate statements that said nothing and communicated everything. The board was restructured over the following months. New appointments reflecting Victoria's own clear-eyed judgment about what the company needed going forward. The stock, after its initial and significant volatility, settled into a sustained recovery that analysts attributed to the clarity and credibility of the new leadership structure. The company had been fundamentally sound for years, its underlying business strong and well-positioned in its market. It had simply been quietly preyed upon by people who had calculated, with great confidence and complete incorrectness, that the person responsible for protecting it was not paying full attention. The months after the storm were the quietest Victoria had known since before her father died. The company required attention restructuring always does, in the way that everything built on a corrected foundation requires the careful work of adjustment and realignment before it can carry weight normally again. But it was the productive kind of attention applied to building, rather than to defending against something that was always approaching from a direction she couldn't fully see. Caroline took the position of general counsel that Victoria had been holding informally for her since the beginning, and the two of them worked through the months of aftermath with the ease of people who had spent 4 years in close coordination, under far more difficult circumstances. New board members were appointed. Operational structures were reviewed, and in several cases quietly rebuilt from their foundations. The company's public standing, initially uncertain in the days of volatility following the disclosure, stabilized and then improved as the market gradually processed the difference between an organization that had been compromised and an organization that had identified and addressed its own compromise from the inside. She found herself, for the first time in 4 years, making decisions from a position of actual security. And the difference was physical. Located in the body as much as in the mind. She noticed it in the mornings. Waking without the particular weight of calculation that had preceded every single day for so long, the constant background accounting of who knew what, who might have moved, what the next threat might look like, and from which direction. She noticed it in meetings, where she was no longer running 2 simultaneous processes, managing the room in its surface reality, and monitoring the room for its hidden one, but could simply be fully present in the work itself, a luxury she had not permitted herself in years. She noticed it most in the evenings, which were simply evenings again, time that belonged to her without a covert agenda attached. Hours that did not require anything of her beyond being present in them. She had one more conversation with Ethan that she had been carrying for weeks, not the explanations. Those had been given and received and integrated, absorbed into the larger story they were building together, but something smaller than all of that, and somehow larger. She told him one evening in June, sitting on the terrace of her apartment, while the city turned gold in the late light, and the air had the particular warmth of early summer that makes everything feel briefly provisional and possible at the same time, that the hardest part of the past 4 years had not been the deception itself. She was entirely clear-eyed about the deception. It had been necessary, calculated, the right call. And she had made her peace with every dimension of it long ago, in the earliest months, when she had still needed to make peace with it at all. The hardest part had been the fear underneath, not the fear of being caught, not the fear of the case failing, not even the fear of losing everything she had inherited and sworn to protect. Those fears were concrete, addressable, the kind of fears you can make plans against. The fear underneath was different. It was the fear that when someone finally saw through the performance to the person beneath it, what they found would not be worth the trouble of staying. She had been alone for so long, in the most fundamental sense of the word, that she had begun to believe aloneness was simply her condition, not a circumstance but a fact, the inevitable and permanent price of the strategy, the cost of the armor that had been necessary, and that she did not know how to take off even after the necessity had passed. The wheelchair had been both protection and prison simultaneously, a mechanism for keeping the world at a manageable and controlled distance while the necessary work was done. And then Ethan had sat across from her at a restaurant on a Thursday evening in October and asked nothing about any of it, and only wanted to know who she actually was, and she had let him further in than she had let anyone in years. Further in, perhaps, than she had intended. Pulled by the unfamiliar gravity of being genuinely listened to, and the terror of that had been unlike anything the strategy had produced. The specific and precise terror of being genuinely known by someone you genuinely loved. The knowledge that you have handed someone the exact information they would need to hurt you badly if they chose to. Because the rest of it she could plan for. The vulnerabilities of the strategy had maps. The vulnerability of loving someone had none. Ethan listened without interrupting, the way he always listened when something mattered, with his full attention, and without the impulse to resolve it before it had fully landed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone formulating a response, but the deeper quiet of someone who is simply present in what has just been said and is letting it settle in the way it deserves to settle. The evening light moved across the terrace around them. The city continued its quiet summer business below. Then he said, "I want to be clear about something." She looked at him. He said, "I fell in love with the person who argued about succulents and hated the smell of fresh paint and woke up before sunrise to stand alone in the quiet. I fell in love with the person who told me about her father in a way that she clearly hadn't told many people, and who listened to me talk about my own mess without once trying to fix it or improve it or make it into something more comfortable than it was. That's who I love. Not the strategy, as genuinely extraordinary as it is, not the company, not the wheelchair, and not the absence of it. You." She held his gaze across the terrace with the city's late light falling on both of them, and the summer evening spreading out in every direction around them. He said, "You don't have to carry things alone anymore. I'm not going anywhere." It was not a dramatic declaration. It had no grand gesture attached to it. No ceremony. It was quieter than that, and more durable. The kind of statement that doesn't require proof of itself, because it is already its own proof, spoken by someone whose consistency over months had made the words feel like a confirmation of something rather than a beginning. She felt it settle into her the way true things do, not loudly, but completely, filling exactly the shape of the space that had been waiting for it. The summer came slowly that year, in the way summers do in cities, a gradual warming of the air. Evenings that lengthened and softened, the particular quality of late light that makes ordinary things look briefly extraordinary, as though the world is demonstrating what it can look like when nothing is wrong with it. They drove to the coast on a Saturday in early July, leaving before 6 in the morning so the road would be quiet and the beach empty when they arrived. The water appeared first as a brightening on the horizon, then as color, then as sound, the particular rhythm of the ocean in the early morning that seems to have nothing to do with urgency. They parked on the coastal road and walked down to the waterline when the light was still new and the sand mostly unmarked, the tide having recently retreated and left everything clean. Ethan walked beside her, not ahead and not behind. And they moved at the easy pace of two people who have nowhere more important to be than exactly where they are. There was no security detail on the beach, no schedule, no performance of any kind required. The specific risks that had shaped the last 4 years of Victoria's life had been addressed. The men who had posed them were facing their legal consequences, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, simply a person on a beach in the early morning light. Not a CEO, not a strategy, not a symbol in a wheelchair, and not a story anyone was trying to tell about resilience. Just herself, in the company of someone who had known enough of her truth to stay anyway. The water was cold and very blue, and moved with the indifferent constancy of things that have been doing what they do for longer than any individual story. The sand showed the marks of where they had walked. Seabirds moved in the middle distance. The sky was the specific clean color of early summer mornings on the coast, before the haze of the day builds. She took his hand at some point, not with any ceremony, not as a gesture meant to signal anything, but in the easy, automatic way of two people who have simply been walking beside each other long enough that it becomes the natural continuation of proximity. And the gesture held in it the quality of someone setting something down, not surrendering anything essential, not giving up any part of herself that mattered, but releasing the weight of what was no longer necessary to carry. The years of secrecy, the architecture of deliberate loneliness, built piece by piece from the requirements of survival and maintained long after those requirements had been satisfied. The particular and very specific exhaustion of being the only person in every room who knows the full truth of something important and must act always from the isolation of that solitary knowledge. The weight of being a secret even to yourself, in the way that sustained performance eventually begins to obscure the performer from their own view. It had been a long 4 years, and here, in the early morning light, on a beach with cold water and clean sand, and a man who had said, "I'm not going anywhere," in a voice that meant it, the weight could simply be put down. She felt it go. The day was just beginning, and it was hers. Fully, and without condition. And it would be followed by other days like it, and the sum of those days would be a life that was actually her own. For years, Victoria pretended she couldn't walk. But the hardest journey was learning she no longer had to carry the weight of her secrets alone.